Hey everyone, I'm from the UK, and I worked in a Burger King for about 6 months. It was right downtown in London. Friday nights were always a whirlwind of activity, with customers filling every part of the dining area. The atmosphere was crazy. It was tiring to work the late shifts. Fights would break out often between drunk customers. People would get sick. It was a real mess. I would have trouble sleeping most of the time when I got off from those shifts. This story happened on a Friday night, about 3 months after I started working there. As the evening progressed, the noise level increased. The place was packed. I was on the cash register. The front door was at the side of the counter where I was, and the dining area stretched out in the other direction. There were parts of the dining area that I couldn't really see from the counter. It was one of the bigger Burger Kings that I had ever seen. At around 11 p.m., I noticed some commotion in the back of the restaurant. I couldn't really see what was going on, but I could hear shouting. Fights were not uncommon in this environment, and I, like many others, had become desensitized to them. I didn't do anything about it. The line was long, and we had a dedicated security guard, so I figured it was not my problem. I focused on my job, trying to ignore the shouting that was coming from the other side of the place. After a minute or so, the altercation in the back seemed to simmer down a little. The noise faded into the background. Just when I thought the night had gone back to normal, an ear-piercing scream shattered the air. Panic rippled through the room like a shockwave, and people started scrambling for the exits. I had seen some things since I started working there, but this was something else. In an instant, my instincts kicked in. I grabbed the phone and dialed 911, even though I wasn't really sure what was happening. I looked over to our security guard, and he was doing the same thing. When I noticed that, I put my phone down and let him handle it. I looked over to my coworker James, and he seemed to be frozen with shock. It was only his second shift, so he really didn't know what to do. Within minutes, the police arrived. The security guard showed them to the far corner of the room. It was out of sight for me. I still didn't know exactly what happened. It wasn't long before I learned the truth, though. Moments later, an ambulance arrived and took a man out on a stretcher. As they pushed him past the counter and out the front door, I could see that he was soaked in blood. That was when I realized that there was a stabbing in there that night. Almost everyone had fled the scene as soon as it happened, and the perpetrator must have been part of the crowd. The police stayed and interviewed everyone for a while, but like I said, I didn't really see anything. I could only tell them what I'd heard. Despite my lack of helpful information, they caught the guy that night. I guess there were other witnesses who were more useful than me. I quit that job not long after, because I started going back to school. It was a pretty big relief for me to be out of that place. My name's Pat, and I used to work at a Burger King. Late shifts were common for me, and that night was no different. Alongside me, Ned, my coworker, and I manned the restaurant until closing time. Ned and I were pretty good friends. We knew each other from school before we even worked together, and we would hang out sometimes as well. As the hours ticked by, the empty tables slowly outnumbered the occupied ones. It was a quiet night, and only a few customers trickled in and out throughout the hours. When the clock struck midnight, which was closing time, Ned locked the front door while I headed towards the back to take out the garbage. The scent of the food waste filled the air as I propped open the heavy back door. Then I went out into the back, which was where the garbage area was. A gust of cool night breeze brushed against my face as I dumped the bags. I turned back to the building, ready to head inside. That's when I saw him. A shadowy figure slinked towards the open doorway. He slipped inside and shut the door behind him, locking me out. My mind went straight to Ned, who was now alone in the place with a stranger. I knew I had to act fast to warn him. I sprinted around the building and pounded on the front door. It was locked, but I had to warn my friend. I had no idea who that man was, and I didn't know if he was armed. Ned turned, his eyes meeting mine, but he looked confused. He couldn't hear me as I tried to warn him. I saw the man behind Ned, who looked more annoyed than anything else. He looked at me through the glass, probably thinking I was locked out or something. He slowly pulled out the keys to let me in. I yelled once more, my voice raw with terror, urging Ned to hurry up. As soon as the door was open, I pulled Ned out and told him what happened. We ran a few hundred feet down the street. We didn't dare to look back, at least for a minute or so. When we did, there was nobody following us. Breathless and trembling, we finally reached a safe distance, our backs pressed against a brick wall. I grabbed my phone and called the cops. As far as we knew, the man was still in the building. We stood there waiting for another minute or so before the police arrived. We went to greet them. After a quick conversation, the police went in and arrested the man who was still in there. When they were dragging him out, I realized that I recognized him. He was a somewhat regular customer. I didn't know him by name or anything, but I had definitely seen him before. That made it even more terrifying for me. Even worse was that later, we found out that the man had a large knife on him. Our guess was that it was a sloppy robbery attempt. Ned had the money with him, so the guy didn't get anything. It would have been really bad for him, though, if I wasn't there to warn him in time. This happened just last month. I was driving to work early in the morning. My shift began at 8 a.m., and it was a little over a half-hour drive to get there. I was always pretty zoned out early in the morning, especially before I had my coffee. This particular morning was no different. As the clock on my dashboard hit 7:20, I hopped into my car, ready to embark on the commute to work. The streets were quiet, not empty, but far from the hectic scene that they would be in an hour or so. I didn't have time for breakfast or to make coffee at home, so I was keeping an eye out for somewhere to stop, hopefully a drive-through, since I was short on time. I had driven this way many times before, and I knew there was a Burger King on the way. It had a drive-through window that was open early. I spotted the familiar sign on the horizon. It was the only place along my way that would be a quick enough stop. I slowed my car and approached the turnoff. Pulling into the drive-through lane, I eased my car to a stop and rolled down the window. The speaker crackled to life, but to my surprise, the voice on the other end sounded faint and distant. It was like the speaker was broken, or maybe the person was just really quiet. I strained my ears, trying to make out the words amidst the static, and I managed to place my order, albeit with some difficulty. I got a large coffee and some kind of breakfast sandwich with hash browns. I paid with my credit card and released my brake. I was the only one there. I rolled my car forward to the pickup window. As it came into view, I saw the worker standing there. Her wide eyes darted nervously, and her hands trembled as she handed me my order. The exchange felt hurried, almost frantic. I accepted the bag and drove away, not really giving it a second thought at the time. She seemed a bit off, but everyone has their bad days. Maybe she wasn't a morning person. Who knows? I continued my drive to work. When I arrived, I parked my car and retrieved my bag of food, eager to eat my breakfast. I still had a little time before my shift started, so there was no rush. When I opened the bag, I pulled out the breakfast sandwich that I'd ordered. When I did, a small slip of paper caught my eye. It was my receipt, but something was hastily scribbled onto it, a message that almost made me panic. It said, "Call 911." Everything began to make sense. The woman in the drive-thru was in trouble, but I was too ignorant to notice. I had unknowingly been present during a robbery or something. I quickly began to question that, though. There wouldn't really be any money on the site, especially early in the morning. A robbery really wouldn't make sense. Without a moment's hesitation, I picked up my phone and I called the police. I frantically told my story to the operator. I later found out that there was a customer who pulled a knife in there. What really creeps me out is that the lady in the drive-thru must have been too scared to say a word about it. That must mean that he was right next to her when I ordered. Otherwise, she could have just asked for help. It's pretty scary to think back on it, knowing that. I used to be a dishwasher at a bar downtown. It was my first job. Working in the kitchen meant that I would get to take off at around 11 p.m., when the kitchen closed. The bartenders and servers were on basically all night, probably making a ton of money to be fair. I was happy to call it a night earlier though. My apartment was a little out of the city's center, since I couldn't afford anything really central. I got off one night and decided to walk home to save a few bucks and to get some exercise. It was a little over an hour on foot to get home, so I would get back at around midnight. As I walked, my stomach growled loudly, reminding me that I skipped dinner. I never cared for the food at work. When I got close to my neighborhood, I decided to make a quick stop at a nearby Burger King. I stepped inside and got in line. The place was busy for the time of night. It was a Saturday, so the party crowd was out. After placing my order, I collected my food and started making my way towards the exit. I was going to go home and eat there. That's when I noticed a man standing outside the front door. He appeared to be in his 30s, with long hair and a rough-looking beard. His gaze locked with mine as I approached, causing me to feel a slight shiver. I hesitated for a moment, uncertain about his intentions. I didn't want to be rude, so I continued. "Hey there," the man said with a raspy voice. "How's it going?" Unsure how to respond, I offered a polite smile and a quick nod. As I walked away, the man started walking behind me. I could feel his presence uncomfortably close. He started making pointless conversations with me, literally commenting on the weather and other equally mundane things. Maybe I was paranoid, but I thought he had other motives for following me. I thought I was in trouble, but I couldn't be sure. As I got closer to my building, I cringed at the thought that he would know where I lived. I made a snap decision. I would circle the block, leading him away from my home. Perhaps then, I could shake him off my tail. I kept walking for a while, and the man awkwardly followed me. He seemed to know what I was doing after we circled the neighborhood a few times. All the while, our conversation continued. Suddenly, he turned to me and stared daggers. "What's your game, huh? You think you can disrespect me like that?" he bellowed. I tried to think of a response, but I had nothing. Out of nowhere, I broke into a sprint. The man's angry voice echoed through the night air. He screamed some threats, but I didn't stop. Panic propelled me forward as I sprinted down the darkened streets. I ran until my legs felt like jelly. My lungs were burning. Finally, I found refuge in a small park. I collapsed onto a park bench to catch my breath. Then I looked around to see if I could find the guy. When I was sure I lost him, I called an Uber and went home. It was probably the shortest Uber ride I had ever taken. I was only a few blocks away from my building, but I didn't want to risk letting that crazy guy see where I went. I never called the police, because that's just not how we do things in my neighborhood. Sue me. As time passed, the incident slowly faded from my memory. I returned to my routine, and even started walking home again. I would see that guy around now and then, but luckily, I don't think he ever recognized me. This happened a few years ago when I was in the 10th grade. I was hanging out with some of my buddies, Brandon and Mike. It was a Saturday night, and we were walking around our neighborhood, looking for a spot to chill out. We had been at a party earlier, but we decided to leave and hang out in the neighborhood instead. It was around 11 p.m., which was late enough that pretty much everything was closed. We knew we weren't going to find anything super exciting to do, but we just kept walking around and talking. We ended up at this retail complex not far from my house. All the stores had closed for the night, but we found a picnic table in the empty parking lot and sat down. There was a Burger King and a furniture store right in front of us. Both were completely dark. I think the table that we were sitting at was for the employees, where they would go for their breaks or for lunch. We sat there talking for 10 or 20 minutes, but after a while, a van rolled up next to us. It caught our attention, and we looked over to see an older guy in the driver's seat, and another guy, probably middle-aged, in the passenger seat. The older guy had long gray hair and a brown button-down shirt. The young guy had a blue baseball hat and a gray jacket. They started asking us some strange questions. They wanted to know how long we were there, and if we'd seen anything unusual. It was a bit weird, but we told them we hadn't seen anything out of the ordinary. They seemed satisfied with our answers, and drove off. I felt a bit creeped out by the encounter, but we continued hanging out anyway. It all happened really quickly, but we shrugged it off and went home after another half hour. A few days later, we heard on the news that an electronics store in that very complex had been robbed that night. I was pretty sure those guys had something to do with it. It was even more chilling, because I think the reason they approached us was to see if we had seen anything. The funny part is that we didn't until that guy came up to us. After that, I reported what we had seen to the police. If they left us alone, we wouldn't have even noticed. The police took our account of what happened that night, but we never heard back. I think that means they weren't caught. The incident gave me an eerie feeling, because I'm pretty sure we crossed paths with criminals that night. It makes me wonder what they would have done if we had seen something. I heard on TV that criminals don't like witnesses. I don't even want to think of what they would have done if we saw something.